Chicagoland weather forecast. From the 1 Hour Heating and Air Conditioning Weather Center, a cool day ahead, clouds, and some sunshine mixed in, high 52. Freezing temperatures overnight. We'll have a low of 36 at O'Hare, but we will have freezing conditions in the west and northwest suburbs. And sun returns for tomorrow morning. Rain by the afternoon, high 53. 44 officially at O'Hare. Next news at 9. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Get Down to Business with Shalom Klein, the show for business and jobs powered by Tandem HR. Heard Sunday evenings at 6.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer.
When did you stop trick-or-treating?
I went trick-or-treating in high school, but I put a white sheet over. I was a ghost.
On AM 560.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, a ghost. Right, Grand Imperial Wizard.
The Answer.
Dan and Amy, we're getting more information from our listeners who apparently know more about this haunted house in Summertown, Tennessee than we do.
What's that?
One from Kevin. My girlfriend looked up this haunted house. One of the pictures was a guy with his eyes taped over with duct tape and some types of worms coming out of his mouth. They say the getting through the haunted house can take up to 10 hours. But it's apparently it's worse than that. A lawyer friend of mine said it's a scam, no fee to enter, but there's a fee going to Vegas where people bet on your calling it quits.
Oh.
It was kicked out of California, is now in Tennessee. There's no chance of winning. Revenue sources kept secret. They can keep you indefinitely up to 48 hours. There's also been accusations of torture.
Well, it looks, when you see the contestants, how they tape them up and blindfold them and make them wear these costumes, it does look torturous.
It's the same thing that we do in the Illinois Republican Party.
Hey-o.
I'm used to the torture here, living in this godforsaken state. Speaking of actual torture, we turn our attention to China. And not just the flap over the NBA, but that adds some additional attention to it, which is good since, as we've talked about in this show, you have Uyghurs, Muslim minorities in China, being persecuted. Detention camps, which sounds like a euphemistic name for what's being done. You have people actually being tortured. There's accusations of organ harvesting and the like. And as Steve Mosher writes in his piece in the New York Times, the Communist Party of China has a goal. The goal is to monitor all of China's 1.3 billion people all the time and, of course, punish people that are getting out of line as it pertains to the Politburo's strictures. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by Steve Mosher, the president of the Population Research Institute, an expert on China and author of Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. Stephen, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's good to be here this morning, but one small correction. I wrote for the New York Post, not the New York Times.
Oh, did I say Time?
The New York Times, by the way.
New York Post, I regret the error, something the New York Times never says. Stephen Mosher, it was interesting to note, even amid tense trade relations, that Vice President Pence said yesterday that, basically China are communist thugs oppressing people. We stand with Hong Kong, and the NBA should be ashamed of itself for being unwilling to speak with that sort of moral clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Basketball is an American game. We invented it. We live in the land of the free. China lives in the land of slaves. They're trying to turn the whole country into a high-tech virtual prison. They've got more surveillance cameras in China than the rest of the world combined. Wow. They've got, millions and millions of people in their police force. They've got the People's Armed Police, which are military units intended to put down demonstrations and shoot protesters if necessary. The way they did in the main square in the capital city, Tiananmen Square, in 1989, they killed 10,000 people to put down the insurrection. And now we've got Xi Jinping, the president for life of China, threatening to do the same thing in Hong Kong. If the protesters don't stop protesting, he said, we're going to kill them and grind their bones into powder. Grind their bones into powder. That means it won't even be a grave to mark the place where they lie. They'll be ground up and blown away. And
the Hong Kongans know that they mean business. They're not kidding around. This interesting piece that was actually in the New York Times about last letters, the protesters writing last letters to their family before they protest on the streets because they know at any time they could be taken to a gulag and ground into dust.
Sure. This was why they started protesting, because China wanted Hong Kong to pass an extradition bill, which meant that they would be able to legally, the Communist Party would be able to legally snatch people off the streets in Hong Kong and take them back and put them in the gulag forever. They've been doing it illegally, of course, for years. People have disappeared from Hong Kong. They've been kidnapped by Chinese security forces. But, the Chinese Communist Party likes to make a pretense of legality, so they were trying to force this law through the legislature, which brought at one point 2 million people out into the streets of Hong Kong. That's 2 million people out of a total population of 7.3 million. That would be like a demonstration in the United States where, 60 million people took to the street. It's an amazing demonstration of popular resistance against Communist Party rule. This is personal for me. I lived in Hong Kong for several years. I speak, read, and write Chinese, including Cantonese, the language of Hong Kong. I've got friends in Hong Kong. And I hate to see this cosmopolitan city, this great city with one of the highest per capita incomes in the world, with a hardworking population, not just of Chinese. There are 80,000 Americans in Hong Kong. There are 150,000 Brits. There are people from India. There are people from all over the world there. And China is threatening to crush this example of free enterprise and the free market.
Does it mean anything that the vice president yesterday came out and is supporting Hong Kong and the protesters?
Yeah. It means everything, because listen, the Chinese Communist Party has never listened to the protests of its own people. It responds to the protests of its own people with the police, tanks, and guns. We've seen that over and over again. But it does respond to pressure from the outside world for reasons of face, right? They don't want to lose. Xi Jinping wants to pretend to be a president, a leader elected by the Chinese Communist Party's Politburo. And if you criticize them, you strip away that pretense and reveal the brutality of China for what it really is. So you cause them to lose face, they'll take a step back, and maybe they won't move the troops and tanks out of the barracks in Hong Kong where they're waiting, lurking. And maybe we can win a temporary reprieve, at least for the people of Hong Kong. But the real prize here, make no mistake, is that the demonstrations for freedom and democracy in Hong Kong will spread across the border to cities like Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou and others. That's the fear of the Chinese Communist Party. If there were an open vote in China, the Chinese Communist Party members wouldn't even vote for the party. So it's a very unpopular political institution. It's a gang of thugs. It's a corrupt elite, right? An oligarchy. We always call the Russian oligarchs what they are. Well, China has oligarchs too, and they're wealthier, and they're even just as brutal, if not more.
Yeah, and this is also time for some introspection. The NBA has provided the impetus for some introspection in this country, because it's not just the NBA that collaborates and turns a blind eye to who China is and what they do when it comes to business interests. Also Hollywood, and that hasn't got enough play. Everything from the remake of Red Dawn to the remake of Top Gun, where they want access to that China market for distribution. It's not just LeBron James and Space Jam 2. It's Tom Cruise, and it's all kinds of other Hollywood A-listers. They want access to that market. In some cases, they're being financed. The movies are being financed by Chinese interests, and so we self-censor to serve the Chinese for access to that market.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wrote a book about a woman in China's one-child policy who was fighting to save the life of her child, and she was on the run, and she managed to escape China and come to the United States. I thought it was a pretty good book. So did the Hollywood producers and executives. But we found ourselves walking into a no-win situation, because China came out against it, and they dropped the idea of the movie like a hot potato. I think this happens all the time. You mentioned Red Dawn, where the North Koreans, for goodness sake, are shown as invading the United States.
Right.
When in the real story, it was China.
China.
And China is putting pressure on American companies to use false maps. I mean, the hospitality industry now has to show maps with the South China Sea as part of China. That's like the U.S. government saying to, Hilton, that you have to have maps showing the entire Caribbean belonging to the United States. It's outrageous. Why would they do that? Why would they abandon their freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly that we have in the United States, and go along with this thuggish regime? Well, on one level you say, well, it's all about the money, but these companies operate in the United States where we have the rule of law, where they enjoy these freedoms, and they ought to at least be willing to stand up occasionally for these principles. Otherwise, we always thought decades ago that when we went into China, China was going to become just like us. Instead, the United States is becoming more and more like China. They're cynicizing us. They're forcing us to abandon our freedoms, including our first freedom.
And it's one thing to turn a blind eye. It's another thing to actually collaborate with the Chinese, as some social media companies have done, including Twitter, that initially, before there was a firestorm of criticism, were helping China to censor Hong Kong protesters.
Yeah. And it's taken far too long for Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook to get out of the China business. They now, I think, have, because they realize that the only reason that China wants you to go into their market is so they can steal your technology, find out how you do your business, and set up a competing company and then drive you back out of the country. That's happened to hundreds of Fortune 500 companies who've gone into China, made big investments. The return hasn't been that impressive, and eventually they're squeezed back out of China, minus the high tech that's been stolen by the Chinese Communist Party. So that's the formula, and I think companies now are starting to see it coming.
Borrowing from Juvenal, the bread and circuses. This is why, in part, why China wants American entertainment, the NBA, Hollywood, because bread and circuses keep the population sedate. What if America and the entertainment industry in America, in all its forms, sports as well as movies and culture, what if we turned, we talk about trade with respect to corporate commerce. What if we turned off the exporting of American entertainment to China? Would that be a destabilizing event for the Chinese communists?
Well, if you lived in a high-tech prison, you'd want escapism. You'd want to escape it from time to time. And of course, we know that Hollywood productions are often serve that purpose for even Americans and people elsewhere in the world. But the desire to escape reality in China, the omnipresent surveillance cameras and so forth, is much stronger. When Les Mis, the great opera performance, was in Shanghai a few months ago, when they got to the point where the closing chorus of "Do You Hear the People Sing?" everybody in the theater in Shanghai stood up and sang it together in one voice. That was a protest. We should tell American companies, if they want the tax advantages, if they want the advantages of being able to operate in America without political interference, without worrying about having their technology stolen by other American companies because we have the rule of law, then they ought to play by those same rules overseas, and they ought to resist the Chinese juggernaut, the Chinese Communist Party, in so much as possible. And the thing about LeBron James, he doesn't understand that the Chinese Communist Party runs an ethnic-based, racist empire that is busy trying to turn Tibetans and Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Manchus and other people who have their own distinct history and culture and language into good, obedient Han Chinese. This is an effort to destroy the cultures of other peoples who live within the borders of China and homogenize everyone into a kind of new Han Chinese man. And it's a frightening prospect, of course, for the Kazakhs and Uyghurs and Tibetans who are now in concentration camps. But it ought to frighten the rest of us and make us understand this is the 21st century version of Nazi Germany that we're seeing form before our very eyes. We've got to be aware of it.
He is Stephen Mosher, president of the Population Research Institute. We lost him there anyway. Expert on China, author of the book Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. Appreciate Stephen Mosher for joining us.
Yeah, and he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, The Answer.
Hey, if you're missing teeth or even a single tooth, then dental implants are a fantastic way to regain your confidence, your smile, and your dental health. Hey, Sean Hannity here. So what are you waiting for? Find out now if implants are for you. Successful implants don't come from an implant factory. Skill, treatment,